I'm so excited to welcome back Dr. Betty Edwards, author of the worldwide best-selling book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, which has changed the lives of countless people by teaching us about the specialized operations of the left and right side of the brain, specifically to help us learn to draw and to think more creatively. So, Betty, welcome. We're so excited to talk to you today about your newest book, Drawing on the Dominant Eye.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's great to be with you again.
Well, it's such a treat. This book, Drawing on the Dominant Eye, which comes out November 10th, introduces us to this whole new way of getting to know and to work with the right and left sides of the brain, which I first was introduced to through your book. And it was such a fascinating read. And I'm just dying to know why eyes? What made you decide to write Drawing on the Dominant Eye?
Well, images of human faces are all around us now, TV especially. And as a result of years and years of teaching portrait drawing and self-portrait drawing, the whole idea was interesting. And there are sayings about eyes. The eyes are the window to the soul, and so on. And what I had noticed all those years there's a difference between the two eyes, a visible difference. And if you look on TV, especially close-ups of news people, for example, you can actually observe this difference. The eye that's linked to the verbal hemisphere is listening to the words, and the eye that's linked to the visual hemisphere, usually, most often, the right hemisphere, that eye is not especially listening to the words, but seems to be watching for other things, facial expression, sound of voice, whether what is being said hangs together, listening to tone of voice, and so on. So the two eyes then are processing different information, and it shows when you look at people closely.
It's just so fascinating. And as a portrait artist, I completely resonate with what you're saying.
Have you noticed that difference yourself?
I recognize for sure that magnetism to wanting to always draw the eyes first, and that's really where we look to find the personality. And I've always noticed an asymmetry because when I was an early artist and just beginning drawing, I thought I had to get the eyes symmetrical.
Yes.
And then I'd notice if I drew them symmetrically, the person would not look like the person. But I never quite took the next few steps to realize that there was a dominant eye playing a part in the whole.
That is so interesting, especially since our students who really are beginning at drawing also draw the difference. They don't notice it at conscious level, but they draw the difference, which I found fascinating. Ultimately, you had to write the book about it.
And so how would one find out what their dominant eye is? How can you tell, and what does that mean?
Well, there are very simple tests, and people listening right now can make this test. The easiest is to simply close one eye, point with one finger to something across the room, say a doorknob or the corner of a window or something like that. Close one eye, point your finger at arm's length, and then switch eyes. You will find that in switching eyes that your finger is no longer on the target, and it will be either your sight will be switched to either the left or the right, depending on which eye is dominant for you. to the right if you are right-eyed, to the left if you're left-eyed. That's the simplest test. There are others that involve a piece of cardboard with a hole punched in it, again held at arm's length on some point of target, and closing one eye and then closing the other eye. But it's very simple. It takes 5 seconds to test it out.
So fun, 5 seconds, and it's a whole personality test almost to understand yourself better and to also potentially help inform your drawing practice and how you might continue your artistic studies.
Yes, yes. Is that the first time you have heard those tests, Jessica?
Actually, I had heard of it before, and I had heard if you just make a triangle with your eye and don't think about it,
that's it.
That you can find your dominant eye.
Yeah.
And I can't recall why someone had me do that, but I'm definitely right eye dominant.
And right-handed?
And right-handed.
And right-handed, right. I'm right-handed and right-eyed also.
So I was surprised by that because in the book, you make the case for if you're right-handed or right-eyed, then because of the cross brain body connection, there's going to be a bit more of a left brain dominance. And yet here I am as an artist and a very reading through the descriptions of right and left brain modalities. I definitely have a whole lot of left brain there. And yet I'm able to get into that right brain zone. So what's your take on that? Or is that just because we're able to work up both sides of our brain? Or
yes, that's exactly it. And that's the important thing that you really want to be able to do. So in your case, you probably a sort of personality thing would right-eyed and right-handed would indicate that you are a logical thinker, that verbalizing is familiar to you, and that if you make a plan, you will pretty much stick to it to the end and ignore other possibilities. That's right-handed and right-eyed. Right-handed and left-eyed, and you'll see by this that it's not creativity, it's really not even art. It is your style of thinking. So right-handed and left-eyed, the verbal hemisphere, the left hemisphere, will want you to make a plan and stick to it. But since you're right-eyed, your brain will be generating new ideas all along the way, and perhaps confuse the progress of your project. And this is typical of right-eyed and
right-handed.
Right-handed and left-eyed. I have right-left confusion, so this caused a problem when I was writing the book.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah, right.
I was just thinking how important both sides obviously are, because I can see now as you're explaining it that often my left brain desire to organize my artistic practice will help make sure that my right brain gets a chance to do what it wants to do. Because if I don't put it in my schedule, I won't sit down in front of it.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can see, looking at a person face to face, you can see the right eye processing the words, listening to the words, actually. And that is attractive to the listener who is, or the other person who's speaking, wants to see that the words are being processed.
One of my favorite tidbits from the book was how you mentioned that if you're in an argument with someone and you want to mess with them, that you can switch your focus to their non-dominant eye, and then it'll completely throw them for a loop.
And keep your focus on it, and they will move around and turn their head to see if they can force you to look at their dominant eye. And if you refuse to do that, they'll sometimes cover one eye, even to sort of force the issue. And if you keep it up, they'll leave you. It's
That's
very,
just
and I really hesitated to include this in the book because it's a kind of mean trick. But it's fascinating. So I put it in anyway.
And it goes to show how often in our communication we have these processes going on that we're not conscious of, that we're not left brain aware of, because it's that left brain kind of narrating the story of our life, right?
Exactly, right.
And it's
Exactly.
so powerful. I was also just so moved by the case that you made in the introduction. Just such a broad and convincing argument for why drawing, a right brain skill, is just so essential for being taught in schools. And you mentioned how visual thinking is more essential now than ever. That we're living in this world of images everywhere, screens. Um, so, how does learning to draw change the way we think, and how does the dominant eye come into all of that?
You know, I was talking with my son this morning, and he brought up an example. A student in one of our classes who lived near a lake and both drove by the lake and walked by the lake. She did a landscape drawing of the lake, and for the first time she realized that the buildings at the edge of the lake were mirrored in the water. She had never seen that before. Now, this is an example of what learning to draw will do for you. You actually can see your surroundings. You can really see, look into the eyes of people close to you, uh, enrich your life in so many ways by learning to draw, and to add information to the verbal system, which is so important.
Oh my goodness, yes. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of Leonardo da Vinci, the classic Renaissance man, and how he had that balance potentially of left and right brain, because on the one hand, he's one of the most famous artists in the world, but also one of the most famous scientific minds of that time. And to be a scientist, one of the key principles is observation.
Yes.
And so much of scientific discovery comes from really seeing the world around us and being able to observe the results of experiments in the real
Yeah,
world.
exactly. Roger Sperry, who was the inspiration for the drawing book, and a Nobel Prize winning scientist, also painted in his spare time. Yeah, and quite well.
Oh my goodness, it's
Yes.
fascinating. I've often heard of people who are, the head of MIT's such and such whatnot, and also, has a side gig doing improv theater. Many people who you might think in all of their success that they must be so busy that they wouldn't have time for an artistic or creative hobby, they're the ones who prioritize that. And it sounds like this sort of research shows that the reason for that is because it allows you to do more with the brain that you have.
Yes. Right hemisphere that is extremely strong. It has been thought to be left-handed people and right hemisphere. It was often thought in the early days as just a spare, that it
Mhm.
was the left brain with language that was the important one, and the right hemisphere just sort of mopped up the details or whatever. But we know now that that the right hemisphere is extraordinarily powerful, can see the whole picture and see also the parts that make up the whole picture, and can see even the parts that make up the parts, and then how it all fits together, or in contrast, does not fit together. So you see your mistakes. All of this is going on non-verbally, more or less non-verbally, in the right hemisphere. Now we need to train up this hemisphere, this important system, and we're not doing that. We need to start kids at around age 8 learning to draw, not to become artists, but to think better, to add the power of the right hemisphere, to see how the parts fit together, to add that to the verbal system, which is a linear step by step system. It has trouble seeing the whole thing and how the parts fit together. So we need to be training this part of the brain. How do we do
Absolutely.
that? We teach these kids to draw. In the same way that how do we train the left hemisphere? We teach those kids to read. It's the same thing.
What are all of the big companies and corporations asking for these days in graduates? It's creative, complex problem solving skills. And that's what we're missing in that left brain focus. And hearing your description, it's like, oh, well, of course.
Of course, right. That's the situation. It's of course, but educators are mostly very strongly left brain people. And they are, I think, almost suspicious of the right hemisphere.
And especially as you mentioned in the book, in this crisis of drawing and art education that we're living through in modern times, so many teachers, because they've never learned how to draw,
Yes,
aren't able to teach it. So
that's true. That's the sad truth, really. So we have to start somewhere. We might as well start with the kids who will later become teachers, who will then see the importance and add it to verbal and numerical, parts of training. It's an ideal. It won't happen in my lifetime, that's for sure. But possibly as more people become interested in drawing and see how their brains are working differently afterwards, that it's a possibility, I think, for the future.
Well, and speaking of the future, I thought it was just fascinating how so much of this ties together visions for what is possible, what's happening today, and with art history. So, potentially, my favorite chapter was chapter 6. Why do we make portraits of ourselves and others? Because as an artist, I'm magnetized to portraiture, and I've often wondered, like, why am I so interested in this? I really loved your review of the very first portrait and self-portraits that were painted by Albrecht Dürer and the artist of the Northern Renaissance. And it got me thinking about this modern selfie craze. And you write on that point. And I loved how you wrote that we are taking these selfies in an effort to see ourselves as we hope others see us. So I'd love to know your thoughts on the modern self-portrait that is the selfie these days, and how we even have these filters and modifications that people use on their pictures to make themselves look different.
Yes, to me it is fascinating also, just as it is to you. It does mean, I think, that we are becoming less verbal and more visual. This TV has caused this, movies. We're surrounded with images all day, every day. And it's a possibility that 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 we will become more visual and less verbal in time. So that, people used to write uh, biographies, autobiographies. Now we do selfies. It tells the whole story.
Mhm.
Uh, there are changes taking place going towards a more visual world. There's no doubt about that. So we'll be seeing what the effect is of all of this imagery.
Well, I certainly hope enough people get a chance to read this book in time to feel that pull to learn to draw, to start learning more about themselves
Uh,
through figuring out what their dominant eye is and how that can inform the way they see the world. So just thank you so much for taking your time to write this book and to speak with me today and share your learnings. And it's just been wonderful getting to talk to you today, Betty.
Thank you, Jessica. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
And if you'd like to hear a little bit more, me and Betty got a chance to sit down about a year ago. So I will link that interview in the notes below. Check it out. And the book, Drawing on the Dominant Eye, comes out November 10th, 2020. You can grab a copy anywhere books are sold. Thanks again, Betty.
Oh, you're welcome.